And speaking of beer, the Great American Beer Festival is kicking off this week as we tape, and so it makes perfect sense that a guy who wrote a whole book about beer would be in town. John Holl, how are you, sir?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
Good. Thanks for coming by. All right, you've written a book about beer.
Yes.
Drink beer, think beer. That pretty much says it all, I do believe.
Yeah, and you know, it's so interesting because we talk about so much of what beer tastes like and what it looks like and what recipes are supposed to be, but we don't often stop to consider like what is happening around the beer that's in our glass. And so I wanted to sort of take that thought and put it into a book of, you know, let's consider everything from the economics to the marketing to the entrepreneurship to everything that's really happening around the glass and because of beer today, and especially being such a huge industry here in the U.S. now, yet again. And that's what the book in your hands is all about.
And this isn't just a one-off. You didn't actually just decide to write a book about beer. You actually make a living writing and talking about beer.
Yeah.
This magazine, Beer and Brewing Magazine.
Craft
you
Beer
edit?
and Brewing. Yeah, I'm the senior editor there, and it's based out of Fort Collins. So.
Oh, it is in Fort Collins.
Yeah,
it's
in
a Colorado
Fort Collins.
publication.
It is, but we're national and international and online and in print, and anybody who wants to know about brewing beer and making beer and learning from the pros, that's what we do.
And there's a podcast, Steal This Beer, which is a shout out to Abby Hoffman's Steal This Book, I imagine.
A little bit, yeah. We taste beers blind on the show, and so they're given to us in black glasses. We have no idea what they are, and we just talk about, you know, we have a candid conversation about what the beer is, not necessarily what it should be.
So basically, you have a gig that half the country would kill for, is basically what you're saying.
You know, they say, you know, everybody says that to me until I remind them that the mornings are really difficult.
Mornings get rough. Well, you just start work really early in the morning.
That's
okay.
yeah, a little hair of the dog.
Yeah, a little hair of the dog. All right, so we have a big beer culture here in Colorado and Denver especially, and what I wanted to kind of know, since you look at this from the national level, where do we, in terms of just the vibrancy of this craft beer explosion, where does Denver and the metro area in Colorado sit in terms of the rest of the country? It's got to be happening elsewhere.
Yeah, but I think it's among the very top. I think people come here for the Great American Beer Festival every year. The Brewers Association, which is based in Boulder, they bring their annual convention to Denver a couple times a year. And what happens is when brewers and drinkers come from around the country and they see this vibrant beer scene, they're usually very much inspired to bring that back home. And I talk to folks afterwards, and you know, I say, well, how did this come about for your brewery in Virginia or North Dakota or you know wherever? And often than not, I'll hear, you know, well, I was at the Great American Beer Festival and I stopped by this brewery and they were doing this cool thing and I thought, well, I should do that where I live. So yeah, Colorado is really among the very top, and I think it just sort of speaks to this can-do spirit that a lot of folks have, this entrepreneurial spirit that people have, and just sort of this general acceptance that consumers have of supporting local, drinking local, and seeking out different flavors.
Yeah, we really like to think that oftentimes people come here, they relocate to Colorado to kind of pursue something. They come here to try and you know, make their best lives happen, and that includes all kinds of entrepreneurship, especially around craft beer.
Yeah.
We talked about this briefly via email because I wanted to bring up a guy named Fred Eckhart.
Yes.
And because what's happening today was not supposed to happen. And so Fred Eckhart wrote this 50-page kind of manifesto back in 1970 on a typewriter.
Yeah, in the 1960s, actually.
1960s, on a typewriter with carbon paper, because that's the only way to make his copies. And basically, it was a how-to guide to make your own beer in your own house.
Yeah, a treatise on lager beer.
Treatise on lager beer. And the fascinating thing was that this guy was actually telling people how to break the law because it was illegal to homebrew beer.
Right.
This was still a hangover from Prohibition days, right?
Absolutely.
And so at the time, and according to Fred, these were his numbers. We had around 73 U.S. breweries back in 1970. According to him, more or less.
More or less.
In about 31 states.
Yeah, and when you think of that number in the 70s, it was Anheuser-Busch had 12 around the country, and Miller had a couple around the country, and you know Coors had one, but there were. It wasn't necessarily 70 different breweries. It was
70 breweries.
Exactly.
70 breweries. And the conventional wisdom at the time was that just because of consolidation and just the way things were headed, that by 1990, according to Fred, there'd be 10. Instead, how many breweries are there in the United States?
Right now, 6,700.
6,700 instead of 10.
Instead of 10.
Okay, so the big question becomes, what the hell happened? I mean, how did this happen? And a lot of this has to do with deregulating it and kind of getting out of people's way and getting rid of these silly laws that say, oh, you can make your own wine at home, but you can't make your own beer at home. So guys couldn't experiment.
Right. I think so much of it has to do with our food culture. If you think around 1920 when Prohibition started, a lot of our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, they knew where everything on the table came from dinner. You know, the meat came from the farmer, from the butcher, vegetables came from the greengrocer, from the farm. You know, beer came from the local brewery, as it were. And then as food technologies advanced, you know, fresh baked bread became Wonder Bread, and real, you know, fake cheese became Velveeta, or real cheese became Velveeta, and we somehow convinced ourselves that a plastic tray in the microwave for 5 minutes was dinner. And so by the 1970s, we had lost a lot of those food traditions. Everything had sort of become automated, a little bit bland. We weren't necessarily thinking about what we were putting into our bodies. And the same thing was true with our beer. We had this sort of one-size-fits-all beer. And people started to push back. And as we started to see, you know, farm-to-table restaurants pop up, and we started to watch cooking shows like Julia Child on television and realize that we could bring some of these food traditions back, brewers thought the same thing. Like, how come we can't bring our beer traditions back? And so I think food and beer really kind of came up together in the same way. And these days, it's when you walk into a brewery, it's why you see, you know, great local food options from food trucks, or that there's, you know, great restaurants like here in Denver, like Euclid Holl, that marry great beer with great food all the time. It's because the two go hand in hand.
And now, when we talk about all these breweries, right, this doesn't mean that there's all 4,700, you said?
6,700.
That doesn't mean there's 6,700 people bottling and canning beer and shipping it to stores to put on shelves.
No.
In fact, the big push here is to avoid those large capital outlays. You're serving it directly to the consumer in a brewery,
yeah,
right?
Tap rooms are huge business these days, and that's where a lot of breweries, you know, you're not going to become a Sam Adams or a Sierra Nevada or a New Belgium if you open up today. It's going to be much more difficult to do, even more difficult than it was for them to do when they first opened in the 80s. But yeah, breweries these days are local gathering hubs, and so you could have a brewery that focuses on pastry stouts, and if you like pastry stouts, that's the brewery you go to. Or you could go to Beer Stott if you want to drink great lager. You know, there's something for everybody out there, and it becomes a destination, and then it becomes a gathering place for like-minded people who all love great beer and want to experience great beer, and then conversations foster, you know, about politics or about what's happening in their neighborhood, or, you know, just about life in general. And beer sort of becomes this addendum to life, but everybody has come in for that one reason. And yeah, it's really cool.
The place right around the corner from me, Joyride, it's just, they serve nothing but their beer.
Yeah.
Food trucks park outside, people eat there. I tried to get a Coke there, so sorry, just beer. And it's jam-packed all the time. It's really an interesting thing. Sorry, we're running out of time. Tell us where, if people want to read your book, where can they get the book?
Where fine books are sold. Here in Denver, it's The Tattered Cover, but online and, you know, wherever you find books. And same thing with the magazine. You can find that on newsstands and online as well.
All right, well, thanks, John. Thanks for joining us. And check us out at independenceinstitute.org. See you next week.